Walt Disney is a name that is synonymous with American culture. He's the guy who would help create what would become the biggest entertainment company in the world. I mean, have you seen the chart of everything they own? I mean, it's almost as big as Gaston's ego.
No one's slick as Gaston, no one's quick as Gaston.
But did you know that they actually almost went bankrupt? And similar to the United States economy, it was actually World War II that would save them. But before we talk about that, let's go all the way back to 1918, when Walt Disney would work for the Red Cross. According to WaltDisney.org, by the summer of 1918, the Germans were on every American's mind, including Walt Disney, where he was living in Chicago at the time, and his father was involved with the Ozell Jelly Company. Walt did not want to return to McKinley High School. He even had written the principal, Mr. Cunningham, that he had been disgusted by his previous year there, starting to dabble in the entertainment industry. Well, Walt and his friend Russell Mass put down a down payment on a movie camera and intended to begin making children's films. And just like many young men during that time, including his two older brothers who were already involved in the war, Walt had an interest as well. Walt said he saw his brother Roy's uniform and was absolutely amazed. He said, "I tried to get in there, but he was only 16 and 17 was the minimum age for enlistment." Walt was determined to be part of this effort. First, he tried to sign up for the Navy, but once again was turned down due to his age. Next, he and his friend Russell Mass attempted the Canadian Armed Forces even, except Russell was rejected for his poor eyesight. But they wanted to go in together, so they concocted yet another plan. They would join the Red Cross Ambulance Corps. And well, the Red Cross Ambulance Corps wasn't as quite particular on the subject of age, applying as this falsified St. John's brothers. These two 16-year-old young men were told they still needed their parents' signature for their forms, as well as passports. During all this, Russell's mother had found a suitcase in the early packing stages and suspected something was going on. She alerted Walt's mother, Flora Disney, and Walt, well, confessed the whole plan, but Elias, Walt's father, just refused to sign the enlistment documents, exclaiming, "I might be signing your death warrant." However, shockingly, Flora Disney took Walt's side in the matter, saying, "3 of my sons have left this family in the middle of the night," and Walter was determined to go. Flora continued, "Even if he has to sneak out like his brothers, I'd rather sign this paper and at least know where he is." Elias was furious and concluded, "Forge my name if you want, but I will not sign," storming out. Well, Flora did, yet Walt's actual birth year, reflected 1901, would still keep him from the ambulance corps, so Walt himself determined to go, just by changing it to 1900, so on September 16, 1918, he officially enlisted. And Walt didn't really see this as war, but as he claimed, an adventure. And he would wrote to a friend back in Chicago, Virginia Baker, that he was actually having a good time and had met lots of old friends and made some new ones already. Unfortunately, Walt would contract influenza, which was a horrible global epidemic at the time, so he had to move back home to recuperate, and his mother, who was also ill herself, would nurse Walt and his sister Ruth, and eventually he had to leave his ambulance unit. He would, however, find out during this time that his friend Russell had already shipped out to France, and he was assigned to a new training base in South Beach, Connecticut. One little side note that really has nothing to do with this topic is that while Walt was at the South Beach, Connecticut base, he would meet a 15-year-old Ray Kroc, who, if you don't know, would be the founder of a pretty popular restaurant named McDonald's. But anyway, on November 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed at Copenhagen, France, and end the war and Walt's dream of glory. So it was time to come back home. So in 1919, Disney would move back to Kansas City, where he grew up, to pursue a career as a newspaper artist. His brother Roy would get him a job at Pesman Rubin Art Studio. And this is where Walt worked at the Kansas City Film Ad Company, where he made commercials based on cutout animations. It was during this time that Walt Disney would begin experimenting with the camera, doing that hand-drawn cell animation, and then he would finally decide to open his own animation business. he would recruit Fred Harmon as his first employee, and both of them made a deal with the local Kansas City theater to screen their cartoons, which they called Laugh-O-Grams. They were incredibly popular, and Disney was then able to open his own studio, which of course we all know today as Walt Disney Studios. Walt would continue to make these little shorts, and then in 1928 we got introduced to arguably the most iconic cartoon character of all time, Mickey Mouse in Steamboat Willie. But Walt was thinking something much bigger than that. Often, as he has done throughout his life, he was going for a full feature-length animated film, something that had never been done before. Well, he did it. Despite almost failing and despite having a complete redo of the film, in 1938 the world got introduced to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Of course, as we know, it was extremely popular, not only because it was the first of its kind, but because it was a really good movie, winning an honorary Oscar that year. And it was also big at the box office, earning $1.5 million, or just above $31 million today when accounting for inflation. The problem was it also cost a lot of money to make. I mean, think about it. It's never been done before, and animation, even today, is expensive, and the film went over budget. But it did do well enough to keep the studio afloat. Unfortunately, the preceding films, Pinocchio, Fantasia, Dumbo, and Bambi, just did not bring in the same profits despite being seen as classics today. And this would lead into the 1940s, which, let's just say, were not kind to Walt. Walt Disney Studios were facing potential bankruptcy already, layoffs occurred, and then a labor strike ensued as well. In 1941, the Disney strike would happen. Employees found out how much Walt was making compared to them, and they didn't like it. And the women were making even less than that. And Walt Disney was not a fan of unions and believes his employees should be grateful for the studio he built. The problem really was not that the fact of how much money he was making, how much they weren't making. The problem was there was a clear level of difference between the top animators and the lesser animators. The top animators were treated way better, got way better perks, while the lesser employees couldn't even afford to eat in the cafeteria. In 1941, he did try to fix the issue, but instead he just made it worse by saying this. "My first recommendation to the lot of you is this," he said, "put your own house in order. If you're not progressing as you should, instead of grumbling, growling, do something about it." This speech did not help them and just led to more employees joining this union. So, between the ongoing tension at the studio and the United States' involvement in World War II with Pearl Harbor, Walt Disney made a choice, and that was to help the United States in the war effort. This started when Walt would allow the United States to occupy his Burbank, California studio, which would be the only Hollywood studio to do so. And according to the Walt Disney Family Museum, studio employees devoted 90% of their wartime output to producing training, propaganda, entertainment, and public service films, while also designing an extensive collection of insignia and print media. Walt Disney's first government contract was executed right after Pearl Harbor and was with the US Navy. The studio was tasked with creating 20 war-related animated shorts for a total cost of $90,000 and at $4,500 per short, which was way more than they normally made on those. And although Walt Disney was a patriot himself and even attempted to join the war effort back in World War I, he was hesitant at first, a fear of just being seen as a propagandist, and as well as that, he just didn't want to live in a world where he was profiting during a war when people were out there giving up their lives. Wallace Duell, a member of the Wartime Coordinator's Office, told a Treasury Department official, "Disney is fearful of being labeled as a propagandist in the public mind, with consequent damage to his reputation as a whimsical, non-political artist." Still, the mogul, who expressed few overtly political views at this stage of his life, would later become active in conservative and Republican politics. He made peace with orders to put his studio on a wartime footing, commenting in an audio clip played in the show that it was kind of exciting. The company would also go on to create over 1,200 insignia for different military units, including the Women's Air Force service pilots and the famed Flying Tigers. Disney designed nose art on airplanes featuring many popular Disney characters like Mickey and Donald were seen as a morale booster. One of these being war bonds, which of course were a huge part of raising money for the war, and Disney would play a role in this as well. In 1943, the company would grant the Treasury Department permission to use 22 characters, among them being Donald Duck, Bambi, and the Seven Dwarfs on the borders of bonds for children. You can actually go on eBay and buy these war bonds right now. They're not cheap by any means. They go for about $150 to $450, but it is interesting that you can still find these around today, and they're definitely a great piece for anyone who's interested in collecting both Disney and World War II memorabilia. Disney was also not just responsible for the animated shorts during this time, they also would provide a lot of film for many of the war movies at that time, including Why We Fight, Turning Transmitters, and Victory Through the Air Power. They went from producing 30,000 feet of film to 300,000 per year. Oh, and feet of film, if you don't know, is just essentially how much time you have to record. If you have 400 feet of film, let's say, and you're shooting at the standard 24 frames per second, you get about 4 minutes to record. And if you're wondering, Disney would also provide like the title cards and stuff like that for these short movies. Of course, we can't talk about Disney's involvement in World War II without talking about the propaganda shorts they created. Oh, wait, before that, it is also worth mentioning that Disney didn't just completely abandon making full feature-length films during this time. They did produce several of them. This is commonly referred to as the wartime era. This includes Saludos Amigos, The Three Caballeros, Make Mine Music, Melody Time, Fun and Fancy Free, and It's Your Bud and Mr. Toad. You probably have never heard of most of these, if any of them, and you probably haven't watched them, or if you have, they're definitely nowhere near any popular list. That is mainly because the budgets were small, and the teams were small, and the overall quality was just much lower because of how much effort was going towards World War II. I mean, a lot of people don't even consider these movies as a part of the Disney canon. Of course, the most significant thing Disney would do during this time were those propaganda shorts. They were designed to not only entertain audiences and be a good morale booster during this crazy time, but also remind them just who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. They would also use these to show what life could be like under the Nazi and Japanese rule and how great it is to be an American. Now, of course, I don't have time to go over all of these, so I'm just going to talk about the most significant ones. In this short, we see right away a very exaggerated version of what the Germans looked like, and the Japanese as well, singing a ridiculous song talking about hailing Hitler, and then we cut to a Donald Duck living in Nazi Germany. This short was not only portraying Germany in the light that it was absolutely ridiculous and over the top how often they would have to say the words "Hail Hitler," but also it was showing just how tough life can be. He pulled out the coffee and the bread, the coffee only having one bean and him not being able to make any really, and the bread that was extremely stale. We then cut to him going to work, where he clearly is having a terrible time with not only doing the job at hand, while also hailing Hitler every 2 seconds just to be driven to insanity, before he finally wakes up back in America, exclaiming, Of course, this was just one short created during this time, and all of them have some sort of significance. So I actually do suggest taking the time and watching these at some point. They're not very long, and they really are an interesting look at not only what life was like during World War II in America, but how they portrayed these people in a negative light. But I can't talk about Disney in the 1940s without mentioning the infamous Song of the South. Releasing in 1946, the Song of the South is set in a plantation, specifically in Atlanta, Georgia, taking place right after the Reconstruction era, basically after slavery. As World War II was coming to an end, Walt Disney and the Walt Disney Studios was a huge part of keeping the spirit of America high, just creating a way to escape all of the negativity going on in the world, and this would help Disney become a powerhouse among consumers, and then would help Walt Disney's reputation, but also the reputation of the studio as well, which would not only lead to the silver era of films with the likes of Cinderella, Peter Pan, and The Jungle Book, but would also help the eventual creation of Disneyland in 1955. And if you're wondering if you could go to Disney Plus right now, like you can with many other shorts during the early stages of Disney, to watch these, not gonna happen. And it's probably never going to happen. You're never gonna see this on any official Disney platform. I mean, it's hard to find a lot of these on YouTube. They just were not replayed that much. It's honestly amazing that we even have the opportunity to watch them today. The reason for this is a lot of these shorts were very politically motivated and also featured a lot of racial stereotypes and attacks across many different groups, including the Japanese, African Americans, the Germans, and unfortunately, it didn't really end after the war. There was still some slight racially motivated stereotypes during the movies after World War II. And that's why you'll see when you go on Disney Plus, there's a little warning at the bottom of many of those movies saying, hey, the world we lived in back then is not the same views we have now, so watch with a caution if you might get offended by that. It's interesting to think how important both Disney and the United States needed each other during this time. I mean, if Walt Disney ever got the opportunity to do these shorts, we probably wouldn't still have a Disney today. No Disneyland, no Disney World, and a lot of the best animation films of all time wouldn't exist, and animation probably would be in a different place. But on the United States side, a lot of the positivity and just the morale that was happening during World War II, of course, just couldn't have been that high, but Disney was that one escape for many people. But what do you think? Should these shorts be more accessible? Have you ever seen these shorts before, and do you have any interest in watching them? If you are interested, just go up on YouTube and look up Disney World War II propaganda. There's a playlist with many different shorts during that time. Let me know in the comments. Let me know. I appreciate you all taking the time to watch this. Appreciate it. Goodbye, everybody.